Hello, here we are going into part three of the American politics orientation, looking at geographical divides with cultural, historical, and political roots in the United States. And again, some interesting data as well. This is a map of the election returns that President Trump started handing out soon after he was inaugurated. He, of course, was very concerned that people didn't think he really won the election, and he wanted to convince people that he really not only won, but he won big. He won, as he put it, in a landslide. So this map is the map of the vote by county across the United States. The blue are the counties that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. The red are the counties that Donald Trump won in 2016. And you look at this visual, and of course, he'll look at that and say, look at all that red. I just was overwhelming across the country. What that leaves out is that, in fact, he lost the popular vote by 2.1 percentage points, or almost 3 million votes, and that his return, or his margin in the popular vote, was 47th out of the 49 presidential elections that had been held up to that point that had a popular vote roll. In the Electoral College, despite his claim of a landslide, it was about 46 out of 58 elections. It was a solid, comfortable lead. But it was not an overwhelming landslide the way some other presidents like Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan and Lyndon Johnson had experienced in the past. What the map does highlight, though, is the geography of division in the United States. You can see that there really are pockets that widely separate parts of the country from other parts of the country in terms of political outcome. It also, we're going to see, and is a series of maps, the power of framing and what it is, how you show and how you characterize goes a long way in how something is understood by people that you're presenting to. Let's turn to 2020. This is the Electoral College, or the state win map across the country. And of course, we do it by state in the United States because the winner of a state gets all the Electoral College votes. And again, the Electoral College votes are a total of the 2 senators for each state, plus whatever number of House districts are in that state. And so California has 55 House districts, for instance. And so there is a slight or somewhat of a representation of population, although Wyoming, which barely has enough people for 1 congressional district, gets actually 3 Electoral College votes. So we look at this and we see, wow, it looks like the Democrats are left coast, right coast, maybe some of the upper Midwest, but a lot of the country, the heartland of the country, the middle of the country is really deep red Republican, and most of the South as well, except for now Georgia, which has been a flip from the most recent period of time. Let's look at this in terms of counties. Well, now when we go down to the county level, we get that representation again of what Donald Trump was extolling, which is, it sure looks red. This looks like a red country with some spots of blue around the nation. It doesn't look like the Republicans have really dominated. And in the sense of geography, they really have dominated. Let's take another look. This is by Electoral College. So now we get this greater representation of population. And what we see is a lot more blue now, and a kind of more even balancing out. In fact, of course, Joe Biden won the majority of the Electoral College votes, the same majority basically that Trump had in 2016. And so this is, in a sense, a fairer representation of the actual divide of the vote. Let's do another map, though. Let's do it by the number of votes for each party in each location. And now we see a very different impression of the election results. We certainly get the affirmation that the Democrats are highly concentrated on the West Coast, highly concentrated in the Washington, the Boston corridor on the East Coast, and in some other major urban areas. We also get a pretty good sense that Republicans dominate in rural areas, but we also see that there's not a lot of population in those areas. So Wyoming and South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana go from being large land masses that look bright red in that first map to basically largely unpopulated, and the Republican votes spread out across that large geographical area. So this gives us a different kind of representation of where the parties are, what strength they have relative to one another, but identifying this very significant distinction between urban areas and rural areas that we'll get to. It's also important to think about California in these terms, for those of you who are going to work in California. Here it is from that first map, a blue state. That's pretty clear. Joe Biden won almost 2/3 of the popular vote in California. Donald Trump just over a third. Pretty dominant. That seems like a blue state. But wait a minute. Let's look at what's happening internally. When we look at the county level, we see that there's a real divide. We've got the Central Valley and the northern interior, Central Valley other than the Fresno area. The rural parts of the state are like the rural parts of the country. They went for Trump, whereas the more urban parts of the state went Democratic for the most part. Another thing that's important to point out is although Donald Trump only got a third of the vote in California, that third of the vote, this is probably a day or two old, was over 5 million people. Over 5 million Trump voters in California. Just to give you some perspective, that's more than the total populations of 27 states in the United States. So when Donald Trump is saying he's not going to do anything to help California, he's basically saying to 5 million of his voters, or more people than exist in more than half of the states, that he's going to ignore them. At the same time, when Californians think, okay, we're going to be extremely progressive and move forward in ways that we want to, contrary to the Trump administration, is a state that has over 5 million people who wanted something very different. Or just take LA County. LA County has a population comparable to the 9th state in the United States. Biden really won here with 71% of the vote to 29%, or 27%, excuse me. But even in LA County, there are well over 1 million Trump voters, which is more than the total populations of 8 states. So it's really important. If you're working in Los Angeles County, you just can't assume everybody's a Democrat, everybody wants progressive action. There's going to be a lot of resistance, and it may be in places where people have some leverage over particular local governments, for instance. Okay, what we're seeing here is, as this figure puts it, Democrats like them big. And what they mean is, this is going back a few years to 2012 election, that the counties where Democrats won landslide results in the presidential election were big population counties, average population nearly 300,000. The counties where Republicans won landslides of more than 20 percentage points are really low population counties of under 40,000 individuals. And we also see that in preferences. This is from the Pew Research Center. Those who are consistently conservative and more likely to be Republican, for instance, really prefer living in rural areas in small towns, overwhelmingly so, not the city. Whereas those who are consistently liberal and more likely to be Democrats, generally speaking, modally prefer cities, or at least city, suburb, metropolitan areas, and not small towns and rural areas. So just the basic preferences of where people want to live and what kind of community they want to be in divides these ideologically, and it divides the two political parties. This is a map, again, of the county level, and this is the 1976 presidential election. And I put it up because what it shows is at the county level, yes, Republicans dominated, Democrats in those days dominated a lot of counties in the South. Republicans dominated a lot of counties in the kind of big Great Plains area and some of the mountain states. But most of the counties were still competitive. Neither party dominated. We move forward to 2004, however, the presidential race between incumbent President George W. Bush and Democratic challenger John Kerry. And what we see is now the South has really shifted towards Republicans. Republicans dominate many more of the counties across the country, and there are really very few counties that are truly competitive. And so now we've got a divide within the country geographically, which is being set up pretty rigid lines between largely rural areas versus more urban areas that the Democrats hold. But that's not the end of the story. Here's another one in which Colin Woodward, a historian, says it's not urban-rural. What we're really seeing in the country is a divide that has historical roots going all the way back to the colonial migration that happened when white settlers came to the United States and they migrated across this continent. And what we see is some of these regions, such as the greater Appalachian area, it's in the yellow and kind of in the middle, Uh, I have a red line around this because you're going to see there's a strong Republican orientation. These were settlers who came with a very intense suspicion of authority. Or you have the Deep South, which of course was a slaveholding society, and very strong animosities towards the national government, the federal government, because they wanted to preserve this horrendous system of slavery as their economic system. Then you had the far west, and there you had, in a sense, a place where very powerful economic interests had dominated and created resentment of individuals against those kinds of major interests that had been more or less supported by the state. So there's a lot of individualism, anti-big power, anti-national government there. On the more liberal side, you had what he calls Yankingdom, which is across the New England and the Northern Tier, which has Puritan roots and a sense of a denial of the individual impulse for the common good. You also have New Netherland, which is really the New York area, which is founded with Dutch roots going back to Amsterdam, and the notion of trade, economic growth and materialism, and the freedom of inquiry and conscience. Very different from, for instance, the Deep South in very big ways. You also have the left coast, what he calls left coast, that's populated by New Englanders who got either on wagons or ships and came to the very west coast and brought many of their values with them. And then you have El Norte, which is a part of the United States, of course, where there was a very significant Spanish presence and Mexican presence. And when the border moved south, so to speak, that took that into the United States. And there's a greater sense of developing one's own characteristics, he says, independence and self-sufficiency, but tends to have an orientation, again, opposed to, more in favor of the possibilities of a national state. And take that map, which is situated by the colonial pathways of migration going back hundreds of years, and put on that the 2016 presidential election map, and blue being Democrat again, and red being Republican, and with some greater degrees of intensity. And what you see is a pretty close alignment with these historic colonialization processes and which party is favored now in the 21st century. Another geographical issue has to do with what a couple of authors call the cultural divide. And they have identified what they refer to as the second demographic transition. And the notion here is, as in this box on the right describes, that those who adhere to high on the scale of the second democratic transition are typically postponing marriage. There's a greater tendency for people to live together, either before marriage or instead of marriage, more single-sex, same-sex households, more postponement of parenthood to later in life. And with that, typically also as well, what they call here sub-replacement fertility, which simply means they're not having a lot of kids compared to those who are low on the scale, and a higher incidence of turning to abortion. And when you use that metric and put it across the country, there are significant geographical variations. And again, we see at least somewhat of a divide, in some ways a significant divide between the coastal parts of the country and the interior, in particular the southern part of the country. Take that map and put it up against the 2016 vote, and again, red for Republican Donald Trump and blue for Democrat Hillary Clinton. And you see some alignment where, again, you get those who are higher in this, you might say, more metropolitan, sophisticated sense of cultural issues are voting Democratic, and those who adhere to more traditional cultural issues are more located in areas that vote Republican, kind of going back to the philosophical differences I talked about in the last part of the orientation. This takes the 2016 vote as well and looks at how states played out, and using those the metrics to identify the states along this divide, this cultural divide, if you will. And what you see is one is California is one of the ones leading the way in the cultural change as a state overall. And where the pinnacle was in the 2016 election, the states that Donald Trump just barely won, Florida, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, were right at that cusp of having a less prevalent versus more prevalent presence of this new cultural affinity for postponement of marriage, later parenthood, same-sex households, and things of that sort. What happened in 2020 is Joe Biden won those states right at the cusp of that, or in the center of that dimension, and they swung a little bit towards the Democratic direction. And we'll have to see what happens over time. The only one left out here is Florida, but that seems to be where the pivot point is in the debates in American politics that really reflect this understanding of whether we are a new culture, a more diverse culture, a more open culture, or whether we are a more traditional culture of the sort that people kind of think of going back to the past. Again, think of Donald Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again." What does that really mean? To a large extent, for a lot of people, what that means is adhering to these older notions of what's appropriate culturally and also appropriately racially and appropriately in terms of the roles of the genders and things of that sort. Another way of, or an important part of reflecting this is to think about what has happened over time to partisan polarization. Partisan polarization is the extent to which the two parties separate from one another ideologically and become more coherent internally ideologically. And I'm going to first put up data from the United States Congress, focusing in particular on the House of Representatives. And this is based on an ideology score that was developed by two political scientists, Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal, but have been joined by many others, including Jeff Lewis at UCLA, who now houses these data at UCLA. And this is essentially a factor analysis that takes all the public roll call votes that members of Congress cast from 1789 to the present. And for each individual representative or senator, calculating their score based on that dimension, based on their votes, that can then be averaged in lots of different ways. You can take the averages or the medians, for instance, by political party. And here, this chart is by political party. The scale on the left is most conservative at the top and most liberal at the bottom. That line you see, the blue line in this case you see are Republicans, and the bottom lines are all Democrats. The dark red are Democrats in general. The yellowish are the Southern Democrats, who, of course, those of you, many of you know, became extremely conservative, often racist, segregationists, and the bright red line are the Northern Democrats. I've stopped the graph here. This goes from 1879 onward. I stopped the graph here where at the time when I was basically a young child. And you can see the Republican Party was at its most moderate during this period. Southern Democrats were at their most conservative, moving in a conservative direction. And Democrats overall, starting in the 1930s and after, were starting to get a little more liberal over time. Now let's see what happens. Two things. Democrats do get more liberal. They move to the left on average, and the Republicans on average move dramatically to the right. The Republican Party in the House of Representatives today is far more conservative on average than the Republicans in this House of Representatives have been throughout this party system since the first election of the first Republican, Abraham Lincoln, in 1860. And you see how that particularly affected the Obama and, of course, going into the Trump administrations. Another way of thinking about this is the scale goes from -1, roughly, for most liberal to +1 for most conservative, 0 as the midpoint. And there's arguments about this, but generally speaking, you can compare these positions across time. And if you take Democrats who were in the -0.5 to -1.0 range, kind of the left half of the liberal spectrum, and you take Republicans in the 0.5 to 1.0, the right wing, they're the more conservative half of their part of the conservative spectrum, and ask what percent of the party were in these respective extreme wings of their parties. For Democrats from 1933 on, generally speaking, have been at around, hit around 10%. Roughly then in recent period, 15% of Democrats are in the left half of their party. How about Republicans? Well, pretty much the same until you get to the 1990s, and then a dramatic turn. And this is using mean scores, which is important to know because they can be pulled by the most extreme members. But what we find is that we find that most Republicans are starting to move in the direction of being in the most conservative half of the conservative ideology scale using these data. And to add to that, the Speaker of the House during the first 2 years of the Trump administration himself was in that furthest wing of the Republican Party. Leadership tends to be more central within their ranks than that. And so we really have a profoundly different House of Representatives when we get into the 1990s and 2000s and beyond than we had before, and a Republican Party that has really moved dramatically to the right. Obviously, this is going to make, and as Democrats have moved somewhat to the left, that's going to make for building coalitions that much more difficult. It's going to lead to, and we're going to talk about this, a real formula for stalemate in the United States because of the difficulty of either side of being able to move any legislation with this kind of arrangement. And of course, the election in 2020 produced results that are likely to make that pretty true as well. This just shows the data for the Senate are roughly similar to the House, very strong correlation, similar kind of ideological polarization. What about the public? Maybe the public isn't so divided. Well, it is the case that most of the public, the modal category of the public is somewhere in the ideological middle, more moderates and not liberals or conservatives. But, and there's a very large part of the American public that doesn't identify formally with either party, although interestingly enough, those who say they are independents but lean Democratic vote more Democratic than weak Democrats. Similarly, independent leaners towards Republicans vote more Republican than do weak Republicans, generally speaking. But the public doesn't line up in Congress, are either a Democrat or Republican with the exception of a few independents. In the case of the public, there are a large number of independents, and then there are people identifying with the two parties, some of them quite strongly. So what has happened? Well, there's been a kind of sorting among the public. The Pew Research Center asked over a period of years questions about what they call 48 values questions of various kinds. And then the question is, how can you explain that variation? Some of it's from gender, some of it's from the religious orientation that people have, some of it's based on income differences, some of it's based on education, and certainly some of it's based on race. But what they found is over time from 1987 to 2012, political party became an increasingly, and it became the most important factor in explaining the differences in people's views on these 48 values questions. And we see that dramatic shift, which is really kind of following what happened among the elected officials in Congress. And then if we break that down by different issue areas or kind of domains, what we see is some really dramatic shifts. Take the environment. It used to be there was almost no difference between Republicans and Democrats on the environment. You had environmental Republicans and you had but not particularly environmentally oriented Democrats. That has completely disappeared. One party is now really the environmental take on climate change party. The other party is the let's not let the environmental regulations interfere with the economy, and climate change is not that big of an issue party. Similar thing on how they evaluate the performance of government, or take immigration. I'm going to show you some data in just a second about this. It used to be there was no difference between Democrats and Republicans on positions on immigration. Now there's a very big difference. Same with religiosity. For instance, Jimmy Carter in 1976 was a Democratic nominee, elected president. He was a born-again Christian. Today, born-again Christians seem, for the most part, to be adhering to Republican positions. And we know that Donald Trump has done extremely well among evangelical Christians who have really come in behind him. Social conservatism, similar kind of theme. Safety net issues have always divided the two parties. Republicans have been much more reticent about using government to provide security for people, as opposed to having them be rugged individualists in the marketplace. But that gap too has grown dramatically. But let's take the immigration issue for a moment. This chart shows, and I've got it stopped between 1900 and 1965, roughly. And what we see is there was a great boom in immigration into the United States, really peaking in the 1920s. And that big purple area, Europeans, people coming from Europe. That included, for instance, my 4 grandparents and my great aunts and uncles who came as fairly poor, not quite peasants, but poor out of the farming communities of Sweden, and immigrated to the United States to start a new life the way so many immigrants do throughout American history. What has happened since 1965, when we were at a kind of nadir in the amount of immigration in the United States? Well, 2 things. One is a big growth in immigration again. So now becoming again a much more immigrant-fed society, but also a very different immigration pattern. Huge growth in immigration from Latin, Central America and Mexico, huge growth in immigration from Asia, and much, much less immigration from Europe. And for those who are opposed to immigration, or one of the reasons why they are opposed to immigration, is they view these different kind of immigrants as being the other. They don't fit the traditional European immigrant into the United States, and that's where they find tension and worries about what these immigrants are going to do to the character of the society. That has led to differences between the 2 parties in how they evaluate immigrants and therefore immigration policy. This was a question that was asked many times, and it reflects the percentage of Americans surveyed who agree, quote, that immigrants today strengthen our country because of their hard work and talents. Up through where I have that vertical line, there was essentially no difference between Republicans and Democrats in either support or opposition to that proposition. And it was not overwhelming majorities, but significant parts of the population, both Democrats and Republicans, thought immigrants brought their hard work and talents. A little while later, in 2007, President George W. Bush, a Republican president, but who had been governor of Texas and had a pretty firm understanding of immigration, proposed in his State of the Union address a comprehensive immigration reform plan. And comprehensive immigration reform almost passed in Congress during that period in a bipartisan way, almost, but not quite. And since then, you can see that the parties have really divided. And of course, the 2016 election with President Donald Trump, or Donald Trump, the business entrepreneur, real estate, or basically apprentice television star, coming down the escalator and making all kinds of anti-immigrant commentary about particularly Mexican immigrants, and making very much his campaign and his administration about blocking both illegal or undocumented immigrants and even legal immigrants, and even those seeking asylum. And now we get this massive divide between the 2 parties, where 78% of Democrats are saying that immigrants strengthen our country because of their hard work and talents, and only a third of Republicans agreeing with that. Another issue has to do again with this notion of the safety net, and what we see has changed. There was a divide between the parties on the question of whether or not the government should help people take care who can't take care of themselves. That split went from a 15 percentage point split to a 35 percentage point split from 92 to 2012. What about we should help needy people, even if it means going deeper into debt, meaning government debt? The split was a 21-point difference in 1992, certainly consequential, but a huge, more than doubling, to a 45-point difference in 2012. So now the parties are really divided on this whole issue of even whether how big the safety net should be, how to preserve it. We've had a lot of Republican proposals, for instance, to make it much harder for people to get food stamps, to get housing support, to be in opposition to Medicaid expansion of the Affordable Care Act, to bring more people under the coverage of health insurance through government financing. Along the way, we see those who identify as Democrats or Republicans in the public have become more ideologically purified, if you will. In 1994, about under two-thirds of Republicans were to the right of the median Democrat, and 70% of Democrats were to the left of the median Republican. We advance through time and eventually get to the point where almost all Republicans are to the right of the median Democrats, and almost all Democrats are to the left of the median Republican. And so among people who identify with the party, there is a big difference between a Republican and Democrat. So we now are in a political age in which if a candidate is running for office, almost all you need to know is that he, she, or they are a Democrat or a Republican. And from a voter's point of view, if you want to know how a voter is going to vote, almost all you need to know is whether he, she, or they is a Democrat or Republican. Overwhelmingly, well over 90% of Democrats voted for Joe Biden, and well over 90% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump in 2020, despite everything that Donald Trump has done in ways that were contrary to what Republicans had traditionally supported in the past, such as free trade and very stringent deficit control on federal spending. If you look at individuals, again, from the Pew Research Center, we see that conservatives tend to hang out with conservatives, liberals hang out with liberals. In fact, liberals are more likely to unfriend someone who's not a liberal. If you ask them, and that's what that shows there, consistently liberal are more likely to block people who disagree with them on places like Facebook and elsewhere. Conservatives talk most often with conservatives. Liberals talk most often with liberals, although with less of a tendency than conservatives to be just within their own cohort. And conservatives talk most often with Republicans, fellow Republicans, and liberals talk most often with Democrats. So we not only get this ideological divide between the two parties, but people are really just, not entirely, but a heavy tendency towards they're talking to people who are just like themselves and have the same ideas. And all that gets reinforced. And we know from all the studies of social media and cable news that in addition to these conversations or connections that people have, what they're getting from the media also reinforces already, going back to motivated reasoning, selective perception, and confirmation bias, a reinforcement of these ideological orientations that people have towards issues. Also important is those who are most conservative and those who are most liberal are also the most active politically. They're the most likely to vote, most likely to engage candidates, and therefore in the primary season, they're the ones who are most likely to come out and vote among the candidates who are striving to get the nomination of their party for president or Senate or House or state assembly or city council, if it's a partisan election, or whatever it might be. And so that more activist voice, which is more ideologically oriented, is going to be a more dominant voice within the election system, particularly in choosing the candidates themselves. Here's what's really disturbing. This is in 2014, again, Pew finding that 27% of Democrats, a big increase, see Republicans, the Republican Party as a threat to the nation's well-being. 36% of Republicans see the Democratic Party as a threat to the nation's well-being. We're not just disagreeing about policy. We are disagreeing about whether or not the other party is actually destructive of the country, and very large numbers. And we see this in a very recent, in fall of 2019, Pew survey research finding that Republicans think Democrats are closed-minded, unpatriotic, immoral. Many of them think they're lazy and unintelligent. And among Democrats, 3/4 think Republicans are closed-minded. Half are immoral. Many are think they're unintelligent or unpatriotic. So a real fundamental divide between these two parties and how they view the other side. The other side can't think. They're not moral. They don't support the country. And here's a kicker. In the 2018 Cooperative Congressional Election Study, the data showed that just over 42% of the people in each party view the opposition as downright evil. It is hard to sustain evidence-based deliberation on policy issues, to even understand what ought to be on the agenda or not on the agenda, what the nature of the problems are, to have a discourse about what the possible solutions could be, and to find common ground when at the voter level, huge proportions of each party think the other side is downright evil. This is one of the fundamental problems those of you who are going to be working in the United States are going to be confronting over the course of at least the first many years of your careers, of trying to solve policy problems and grapple with huge issues, knowing that there's this kind of partisan polarization and divide. And we're going to see that reflected in some of the things that we cover in 202. Don't mean to be depressing. This mean that your work is really important, more important than ever, but you've got to be a crafty, savvy, strategic player to have the kind of effects that you want to have. Now, this is for those of us in public policy programs, as you're going through microeconomics and policy analysis, seeing this, here's a place where Republicans and Democrats agree. They agree that they disagree, not only on policies, but on even basic facts. And so this makes it all the more important to figure out ways to not only do good policy analytic research and to understand policy problems and possible solutions, but do so in a way that goes back to what I said earlier about how to get back to credibility and a consistent and appropriate meaning given to evidence and facts in order to move political debate forward. The last thing I'm going to say in this segment is also somewhat depressing and part of the challenge, and that is what's happened to trust in government. There is a question that's always asked about whether or not people trust those in Washington to do the right thing always, or most of the time, some of the time, or none of the time. When Lyndon Johnson was president and he was leading what he called the Great Society expansions of government, at that time, about 2/3 of the public thought people in Washington, meaning government, the federal government, always or most of the time does the right thing, or you can trust them to do the right thing. That's when Early and Secondary Education Act passed, Medicare program, health insurance for the elderly, Medicaid, health insurance for many of the poor, the various programs that try to tackle poverty, housing programs, the big environmental movement with clean air and clean water, leading up to the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, a lot of civil rights legislation. That happened at a time when 2/3 of the public thought the government would do the right thing. That has changed. And by the time we get to the Obama administration and into the Trump administration, only about 17% of the public trusts the government to do the right thing. And that's a problem. They're not going to want the government to take on big issues if they don't think the government can be trusted to do it right and do it well. This is more recent. A former graduate student colleague of mine, now a preeminent scholar and researcher at the NYU Wagner School, Paul Light, and also at Brookings, did a study of what people want government to do and whether what they also think about what needs to happen in government itself. In the survey, he divided people into 4 categories. One is what he called the dismantlers, who support smaller government that provides fewer resources. So kind of real conservative perspective. And you can see Republicans, the red bar, dominate here. Then another category, the expanders, those who support a bigger government that should provide more services and think that the federal government is basically sound. And a lot of Democrats there, many more Democrats than Republicans. If we went back to the 1960s, that blue bar would be really tall. But instead, we've got the rebuilders, where the Democrats really dominate. They want bigger government, doing more services, but they also think that there needs to be major reform of the government itself. So now there's a 2-pronged task, doing big policy issues to take on major problems and fixing the government at the same time, or maybe having to fix the government first. That is a huge challenge, and one that we're all going to be confronting. And again, it's very important for you to understand as you try to take on this world and figure out ways to build coalitions, to have social movements and so on, that will get people on board with the notion. If you think government is the instrument, how do you get there and do that? For those of you who fall into that dismantlers category, who want a smaller government doing fewer things, in a way, you've got an easier challenge. It's going to be hard for government to do things, but you still have the challenge that there are a lot of big issues that people feel need to be addressed. So how are they going to be addressed if not through some kind of government action? What are the alternatives? Well, this trust in government, this just wraps this up. And the idea, these folks have studied the issue for 20 years, have had 40,000 research participants, and they come the kind of the conclusion is the idea that government is inefficient at best, downright corrupt at worst. They find that most Americans view government as both monolithic and inept, even broken. They see it as the government rather than our government. That's very different from a lot of European societies, for instance. And they rarely recognize the many ways that it is woven into their daily lives. Susanna Mettler at Cornell has a wonderful book about the hidden submerged states. People don't even know they're being benefited by government when they are in very big ways, and they're anti-government, not realizing the extent to which they're anti the very things that they're getting support from. To a majority of Americans, government is the problem rather than an essential tool for solving problems. That was a theme laid out by Ronald Reagan in his 1980 inaugural address. Government's the problem, not the solution. But the disturbing thing, they say, is that this view of government has become part of our collective narrative, cultural narrative, to the point where we simply take it for granted. That is where these normative issues that I've been covering in these last two sections are so important about what it means to try to solve problems in this country and what instruments are there and what confidence do people have in our ability to address those problems and to use government as one of the institutions to do so. I will stop there and we will look forward, or at least I will, to part 4, where I go into some of what this means in terms of American political institutions and some of the interesting ways in which that has played out in terms of policy approaches over the many decades. I will see you then.